the hike. Your room is a mess. Jeanette scowled and crinkled her nose, stepping over my shoes. I looked up at her from my phone, the same look she had on my face. Then why are you in here? I asked, dropping my phone on my bed. It was mid-morning, and I had just finished with breakfast. I decided not to leave my room and feigned temporary sickness. Zach brought up a plate of Eggo waffles before going back to the mess downstairs. You're coming with us. We all know you're not sick, she snipped, standing in the middle of my room. Sighing, I thought back to what they had decided we were going to do. They had wanted to go to the Royal Grove, the park behind my house. There were plenty of trails to go down, but I once again questioned why they would want to do it when it was cold. Chop chop, she turned on her heel, stepping over the miscellaneous items on my floor. Huffing, I sat up and looked around my room. In no way did I want to go. I got ready slowly, finding some clothes on the bottom of my closet. I pulled on a lightweight hoodie, a tank top, and some jeans. My hair was a brown mess. The only good thing about having my hair was that you couldn't tell if it was dirty, which it probably was. Twisting it into a bun, I put in my contacts and walked downstairs. There wasn't a reason to try and struggle with makeup. My family were pushing around each other, getting together bags and lunch. I wanted to tell them that we were only going on a hike, not traveling up Mount Everest, but I figured it wouldn't help. Aren't you excited? Zach teased, leaning against the counter next to me. I blew a piece of loose hair out of my face, glowering at him. Well, I am, he continued, putting his arm around my shoulders. He found my unhappiness amusing. My family loved Zach because he played into their game. They wanted him to jump. He'd jump. I envied that, because I simply wouldn't be a pet. Zach hated it, but he also hated drama within the family. So, he acted like the golden boy of the family, even though they drove him crazy, and he got extra pie at night. I was almost the black sheep, constantly pointing out the wrong when everyone was focusing on the right. We stood there for a few more minutes before we were ushered outside the house. Zach was forced to ride with Aunt Laura, but only glared at me when I laughed at him from my car. Zach didn't have a car because he totaled it, acting like he was baby driver. My parents refused to get him another one until he finished his alpha training. I followed them out, but drove slower than all of them as to fall behind. The welcoming center was quite a ways inside the park, so the drive took some time. Halfway there, I decided to call Maddie, figuring my misery should be spread. The phone rung twice before she answered. Hey darling, what's up? She said once she answered. I could imagine her lounging on her bed, and sighed. I'm about to go to my impending doom, I told her, looking at the thick forest I was passing. Maddie laughed. Fun time with family? She asked, and I nodded stupidly before answering yes. Maddie knew how much a pain my family was, both me telling her and Zach. Soon enough she'd be in my family as well, and would be forced to come to our fun family gatherings. Thanksgiving is boring, she said slowly. I agreed, my hands tightening on my wheel as I saw the sign for the welcome center. Sarah loves Thanksgiving, Maddie said absent-mindedly. I felt guilt pit in my stomach as I thought of Sarah. Because Sarah's parents were gone all the time, she relied on holidays for them to come home. They always came home for Thanksgiving, and it was the only time she knew they definitely came home. She nearly ran out of school early just so she could go home and see them. Even on Christmas, she wasn't sure if they'd come or not. They always had presents sent to the house and FaceTimes her, but it wasn't the same as having them there. Yeah, I sighed, thinking of her. It was stupid how much I hated my family coming to visit, but at least my family actually showed up. Just as I was pulling up to the welcome center, Connell's name flashed onto my phone. Got to go, Connell's calling, I told Maddie. Maddie bid me goodbye, and I pressed accept on my phone for Connell. You better be quick. I have to spend 5 hours with my family in the middle of the woods, I told him, pulling into a parking spot far away from my family. Connell chuckled, his warm laugh filling my car. Annoyed, I unplugged my phone from my car, putting it to my ear. Calm down, Tiger, Connell calmed. I could hear the sound of a car crank on the other side of the line and sat back in my seat. You know, it's actually a coincidence because I was just about to take Jay for a walk as well. I heard the sharp bark of his dog from the phone. Smiling, I lifted my chin up, looking at my ceiling as he kept talking. "We're going to be at, I heard him pause and wait for me to answer. I rolled my eyes before smiling. "Royal Grove," I answered for him. He said yes in agreement, and I could hear him start to drive. "I'll be there any moment," I hear him tell me, and I smile softly. Just as I am about to say something, a knock made me look away from the door. Aunt Jessica stood there, motioning for me to get out of the car. Behind her stood my family, finishing up getting everything from their car. Waving her away, I picked up the phone again, sighing aggravated. "Please hurry, I just might say something I shouldn't if I'm left alone with them any longer than necessary," I told him, unbuckling my seatbelt. "We'll be on Raven's Trail. It's just off the welcoming center." I opened my door, stepping out. I said goodbye quickly and hung up the phone. Joining my family, I sighed when my mother immediately wanted to slather me with sunscreen. "I don't need it," I complained. My mother didn't listen and sprayed me unforgivingly. "Took you long enough, Ruby. We were just about to leave you," Jeanette said as she walked out from the side of the car. "That would have been nice," I mumbled to myself, but replaced my frown with a smile when my mom looked over at me. We started on the trail. I looked at the thick Spanish moss that hung off of all of the trees, lagging behind the group. Nearly tripping, I tried to keep up, whilst still keeping my distance. Time passed slow, between kicking pebbles and panting, and soon enough my parents decided to take a break. My family congregated on the side of the trail, so I turned around and walked back down towards where we came. When I couldn't see them anymore, I sighed and sat under a large oak tree. Leaves floated around me, and though the cold was seeping into my bones, I closed my eyes and let darkness take over. I must have been asleep for a few minutes when I was jolted awake by the feeling of a wet tongue sliding on my cheek. My eyes snapped open, and I came face to face with a panting husky. Connell's husky leaned down again and licked me on my face. Pushing him away, I wiped my cheek and looked for Connell, who was walking up. "You took forever," I complained, standing. "We're wolves, we're supposed to be fast, remember?" In the back of my mind, Dottie whispered hypocrite. Connell crossed his arms, looking me up and down. "Oh really, MS? Always late to English," he drawled, lifting his eyebrow. I laughed nervously, rubbing my hands together as I lifted my shoulders. Walking forward, I grabbed Connell's arm and hugged it, sighing. Connell looked around for my family, but they weren't anywhere to be seen. "Where's the family?" he asked, looking down at me. I looked up at him, and then off where I had left them. Hopefully quite a few paces ahead, I mumbled, shivering lightly under his touch as he moved his hand down my back, stopping at my lower back. Leaning down, he laid a gentle kiss on my lips, and then another on my cheek before stepping away, grabbing my hand with his. "Why don't we finish this another time? Perhaps not in the middle of the woods," he asked, and a frown found its way to my face as I shook my head, fully prepared to whine. Seeing this, he turned away, tugging my hand in the direction that I came. It didn't take long for us to get to my parents. Connell let go of my hand as they came into view and took a step away from me. I glared at his back as we walked up to my family, who were starting to pack up everything and start walking again. When my family finally noticed we were there, I unenthusiastically pointed at Connell. "I found him walking his dog and invited him to join us," I said, before smiling blankly. Everyone seemed okay with it, and Jessica bounded over to Connell. "We just love company here. It's no problem at all," she said in her high-pitched parrot voice. My lips turned down into a frown, and I unconsciously took a small step towards Connell. Zach's eyes floated to me from his place near my parents. He was confused but didn't dwell on anything as he put the heavy backpack my parents made him take on his back. We stood for a few more moments before everyone started walking down the trail. I walked a few steps behind Connell, subtly listening in as Jessica yapped on and on about fashion, which Connell seemed completely uninterested to learn about. After a few minutes of listening to her annoying voice, I decided to get away from everyone. Lagging behind, I stopped and pretended to look off into the forest. Connell noticed this and stopped, looking at me confused. Putting my hand over my eyes to shield them from the sun, I pointed in the direction of a bird that I could see in one of the trees. "Wow," I said loudly, squinting at the bird. Connell still looked confused. "Would you look at that, Mr. Wood? I quickly cross-checked birds' names in my head and randomly blurted, speckled brown. Brownie bird with gray spots." All attention turned to me as I gave my family a truthful look, putting my hand down. "Yep, that's one for the record books, right, Mr. Wood?" I turned my attention to Connell, looking at him to verify. He didn't seem to understand, but he still nodded, putting his hand to his face, squinting his eyes towards the bird. I don't know. To me it looks like an auburn-headed spotted thrasher catbird. We both took a long moment to look in the direction of the random bird before my mother spoke. "Ruby, since when do you know about birds?" she asked, and I put my hand to my chest as though I was offended. I didn't know anything about birds. "Mother, how could you not know about my deep love for birds?" I asked, and my mother crossed her arms, pursing her lips. "You killed a blue bird when you first got your license," she said, and I forced myself to look heartbroken. It was a pretty traumatic moment. "Mother, I still get nightmares from that," I cried, and pretended to look towards the sky and say a short prayer before looking back towards my family. My mother deadpanned at me, and my father just looked confused. "Anyways," I muttered, grinning once again, "Mr. Wood and I are in bird-watching club at Fremont." This time my father spoke up, taking position next to my mother. "I wasn't aware there was a bird-watching club at Fremont, or that you were in it," my father said, narrowing his eyes at me. "It's a new club," I gulped, smiling nervously. I think it would be best if me and Mr. Wood went and found that bird, just to record it." "Don't want to be misinformed," I laughed, and Connell nodded next to me. Without a second thought, Jessica piped up, "I'm come." I turned quickly, my voice coming out before I could stop it. "Actually, Aunt Jessica, it's bird-watching club members only." "You're a few too many years late," I growled, turning around before I could completely lose my composure. "We're off then," I said, and grabbed Connell's arm before anyone could protest, starting for some random trail. My parents say a confused goodbye after a few seconds, and I could practically hear Jessica fume as I walked away. Connell let me drag him down the trail, saying nothing until we were out of both ear sight and view of my parents. Pulling me to his side, he wrapped his arm around my shoulders as we slowed. "What was that?" he asked. "Jessica is getting on my nerves," I mumbled under my breath. Connell chuckled, pulling me to the side of the trail. "You're jealous," Connell laughed. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. A true statement at that. I clutched my necklace in the palm of my hand, shrugging. Still amused, Connell took my hand in his, kissing it lightly. My lips turned up as I hugged him, wrapping my arms tightly around his neck. Connell hugged me back, rubbing his hand on the small of my back. Just as he was about to let go, I came to a realization and pushed him away. "What?" he asked. I looked around before my eyes met his. "Where's Jay?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Fight." Connell looked around as well, but Jay was nowhere in sight. I had seen Jay follow us down the trail since he was a pretty loyal dog. I felt myself get more worried as I looked back and forth, whipping my head so hard it gave me whiplash. Connell held my arms tightly, forcing me to stop. "Calm down," he soothed. I exhaled, trying to lower my heart rate. "We'll just find him," Connell said simply. "How are we going to do that?" I asked. Connell deadpanned and turned to me. "We're wolves, remember?" I blinked a few times before blushing. "Yeah, forgot about that." I knew that I stuttered, crossing my arms and looking away. Connell rolled his eyes before his hands moved to the buttons of his shirt. I watched as he started to undo them, my eyes widening as I inhaled sharply. "What are you doing?" I exclaimed, turning away as he started to undo his belt. Connell stopped, looking at me. "Do you want to rip our clothes?" he asked. I puffed my cheeks, my face heating. I looked away as he stripped his clothes, only seeing them in the corner of my eye as he tossed them to the side. The sound of his bones cracking filled the air, and I winced. A wet nose touched the back of my leg, and I turned to see Connell's wolf. It was commandingly large. He felt much bigger than when I was in my own wolf form, and he came to my waist just standing up. I couldn't help but to lean down and rub his ears. Just as my hands went to my shirt buttons, I looked down at 𝐀𝐿's expectant face. Doing a circular motion with my finger, I watched as 𝐀𝐿 slowly turned. I completely took of my shirt, dropping it on top of his clothes. I could see his paws dig into the dirt as he tried not to look. I rolled my eyes as I took off my shoes and then my pants. Last, I took off my necklace, tucking it in my bra. Looking at the trail, I realized it would probably be really weird if someone just saw us changing. I let 𝐷𝐷𝐷 take over as I exhaled, and my bones cracked as I shifted into my wolf. It was more painful than normal, since I had forgotten again to go running. The pain subsided when I was completely in my wolf form, but I still felt achy in my bones. Nudging 𝐀𝐿 to turn around with my nose, I admired his wolf. He was much bigger than me, with a nice warm caramel coat. It seemed to have gotten lighter since I last saw him, but I think it was just my eyes. 𝐀𝐿 leaned down and licked me on my ear, which was a form of affection. Biting him lightly on his shoulder, I left him in the trail, padding into the woods. 𝐀𝐿 picked up our clothes in his mouth and followed me. Lowering my nose to the ground, I smelled for any sign of J. I couldn't smell anything, so I continued forward, smelling the ground every few meters. 𝐀𝐿 followed me, his ears perking as he listened for J. I slowed as we came to a clearing, my nose to the grass as I smelled for J. The smell that covered the ground was unfamiliar, but it was of another wolf. My eyes went to 𝐀𝐿, who was a few paces in front of me, looking at the woods with narrowed eyes. As I lifted my foot to take a step towards him, a flash of black distracted me. Before I could move, I was shoved down by a large wolf. Before I could kick the wolf off, his large canines sunk into my leg. I let out a howl as I wiggled away from him, kicking his face. 𝐀𝐿's large wolf pounced on top of the smaller animal, snarling viciously as he bit the wolf in the shoulder. The pressure on my leg was released as the wolf yelped, falling off of me. I cowered away from them, watching intensely as 𝐀𝐿 put his weight fully on the wolf, his growl thundering through the woods. I closed my eyes as 𝐀𝐿's teeth bit into the wolf's side, causing deep gauges to appear. 𝐀𝐿 stood, still snarling as the wolf whimpered, limping away into the woods. Turning to me, 𝐀𝐿 returned to normal, worry clouding his eyes. He padded over, licking the side of my muzzle. He examined my leg, listening to my cries as blood started to pool under my leg. I would have to change back into a human, because the skin starts to mend itself in human form much quicker than in wolf form. I shut my eyes tightly as 𝐀𝐿 shifted back to his human form, listening to his steps as he put on his pants. "You can shift now," 𝐀𝐿 told me, and I opened my eyes to see him turned away from me. Shifting painfully, I returned to my normal body as I laid on the ground. I groaned as my hand went to my thigh, which had a large gash down the side. 𝐀𝐿 tried not to look as he grabbed his coat from our clothes, wrapping it around me. He pulled it back slightly to look at the gash, worry etched on his face. "You're going to be okay, Ruby," he assured, wiping away some of the blood with his shirt. He grabbed my shirt and handed it to me, before leaving me to try and change. The gash was already healing itself, the blood starting to clot slowly. When I had gotten my underwear and shirt on, I called 𝐀𝐿 back over. He picked me up, holding me close to his body. "Why do they want my necklace so badly?" I mumbled as my hands tightened around my necklace. 𝐀𝐿 looked down at me as he walked through the forest, his expression unclear. "I don't know, darling," he said slowly, sighing as he walked onto the path. I put my face in his shirt, inhaling his scent deeply to calm down. I wanted to cry, but I felt like if I started I wouldn't stop. As we came to the turn in the path, Jay popped out, barking happily. I eyed him as he wagged his tail happily. "See, we found him," 𝐀𝐿 told me, rubbing my arm. I looked up to him, my eyes narrowing. He leaned his head down and kissed my cheek, before continuing on the path. It took a bit, but we finally came to the parking lot. Once we had arrived, 𝐀𝐿 put me in the passenger seat of his car. He sped on the drive home, watching me. My leg had stopped bleeding and would begin to slowly mend itself, which would take a few days. As he helped me up his porch stairs, I started to think about my parents. "I should probably call them," I said slowly, thinking of their reactions when they realized I hadn't joined them. 𝐀𝐿 agreed, looking through my pants pockets to find my phone. After he handed it to me, he helped me up onto his kitchen counter before looking for his med kit. I texted them that I had decided to go home since I was still feeling quite ill. They must not have gotten it, because neither of them replied. He patched me up quickly, first by running some water over it, cleaning the dried blood off. The cut wasn't as big as it could have been, and since it would naturally mend itself, it didn't need stitches. Connell wrapped some white bandages tightly around it before moving me to his couch. "I need to go get your car," Connell said after he wrapped a blanket around me. "Wait," I stopped him, grabbing his arm. Connell looked down at me, tilting his head as he waited for me to speak. I took a deep breath, giving him a serious look. "Take care of my car. She's my baby. Secrets exposed." I stared distastefully at the orange table spread that adorned the kitchen table. Plates were already set, cups filled with ice, yet we were still waiting for the food. "How much longer?" I complained, looking at the bustling kitchen. I had been banned from stepping anywhere near the food, considering I had sticky fingers when it came to delicious treats. "Patience is a virtue," my mother answered from across the kitchen, earning an eye roll. "I don't care. I just want to know when I can start eating the rolls," I said impatiently, kicking the leg of my chair methodically. My mother shot me a glare before cracking an egg into her chocolate batter. It was Turkey Day, the day of giving thanks, watching football and food. Lots and lots of food. "Can you get any more annoying?" Jeanette said, crossing her arms as she leaned into my couch. I stared at her, crossing my own arms. "You're on my couch right now, Jeanette, in my house." "Shut up," I answered, stalking away from her. I ran upstairs, a sigh leaving my lips. The worst part of Thanksgiving was waiting for the food. "Such a first-world problem," Dottie chirped as I fell onto my bed. I groaned, my stomach grumbling. "Maybe," I answered, crawling beneath my covers. Connell was alone in his house, but I hadn't found a way to sneak out. My family were all watching like hawks, every glance at the door setting off a little alarm in their head. It was the day of family, and that didn't include Connell. For them, at least. I shut my eyes and fell into a light sleep, snuggling my teddy bear tightly as I tried to sleep. In the back of my head, I could hear the distant ruckus of my family tampering around the kitchen below. I was barely asleep when a hand shook me awake, causing me to jolt up. "Wake up, sleepyhead. It's dinner time," Zach said, hitting me repeatedly on the arm. I squeezed my eyes shut, throwing my hand in the direction of his body. We hit each other back and forth before he grabbed onto my arm and pulled me off the bed. I bounded up, chasing him out of my room and down the stairs. "Ooh," Jeanette scowled as we pushed past her, shoving her lightly into a wall. I wrapped my hand around Zach's bicep, pulling with all my might backwards to throw him off balance. It didn't work, and instead I slipped on the hardwood floor and fell to the ground. Luckily, Zach tripped over me, so we both ended up squirming on the wood. "Children, stop it," Aunt Laura hollered, causing me and Zach to stop in our places. We both looked towards the kitchen, where all of the parents were staring us down. Throwing a cheeky smile to my aunt, I started to get up, putting my hand in Zach's face as I stood. Zach glared, but straightened his clothes and stood next to me. "Dinner time," my mother announced. Everyone found a place at the table, sitting patiently, or in my case, impatiently, for everyone to say thanks. "I'm thankful for my family," my mother said cheerfully, looking at my father with happiness. Zach and I looked at each other, a soft smile exchanged. No matter how much they fought, they always found a way back to each other. "Well, I'm thankful for finding my mate," Jeanette continued. I blinked, looking at her. She seemed sad. Underneath the fake happiness, if anyone could spot fake happiness, it was me. I took a long sip of my sweet tea, my eyebrows going up as I watched the rest of my family say their thanks. When it was Jessica's turn, she got this coy look on her face. "I'm thankful for Mr. Wood. He is one handsome man," Jessica giggled. "Looks like someone had a few too many beers." My eyes immediately shifted to Jackson, who shuffled in his seat. His gaze went to his plate, and he just stared at the empty space. I felt jealous bubbling inside me once again, like it had a few days ago. Exhaling deeply, I chugged another gulp of my drink, leaning back in my seat. "Please, Jessica, control yourself," Aunt Laura scolded, shooting Jessica a look. Lifting her hands, Jessica smiled, grinning to herself. "I'm just saying, that man is yummy," she countered. I looked away from Jackson and straight at Jessica. There was some part of me, whether it be my wolf or not, that was starting to become very agitated. That other part started to take over my tongue as I watched Jessica. "Aren't you thirsty?" I said slowly. All attention turned to me as I glared daggers into Jessica. I could feel Dottie and I's personality switching back and forth, fighting for control. Dottie was winning. "Bah. Excuse me," Jessica asked, shock clear on her face. I tilted my head and shrugged, taking a sip of my tea. After I swallowed, I put my glass down. "It's almost like you're obsessed with him," I said simply. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Zach shift uncomfortably, presumably not knowing what to think. I turned my attention away from him, returning to stare at Jessica. "I'm a grown woman. I can like whoever I want," she retorted. Everyone was silent as we stared at each other. "Just because you don't have morals doesn't mean he doesn't," I spat. My mother gasped lightly, and my father took a long swig of his Jack Daniels. Jessica narrowed her eyes at me, sitting up straighter. "You're too young to understand," Jessica rebounded weakly. I exhaled deeply, and I could feel Dottie take full control. "You know what you don't understand. You don't understand how to back off," I hissed. I struggled with Dottie, fighting to take back my voice. "Ruby Delson, you stop at this instant," my mother interrupted, causing me to look at her. Dottie was far too into control, her protective side coming out full force. "I won't, because he's my mate," I confessed, standing. "And I don't want your grubby little hands getting close to him," I exploded. Jessica and I'm sure everyone else's mouth fell open in shock. I stood there for a few seconds, looking at all of them. Dottie quickly lost control, and I was fully in control over myself. Stumbling backwards, I watched them as I looked for a way out. "Ruby, stop," my mother said, but I was already rushing towards the door. I blocked them out as I ripped open the door, slamming it after I took a few steps. I could feel my tear ducts starting to churn as I ran through my yard. The one secret I was supposed to keep was no longer a secret. My stomach turned as I ran up the steps of Connell's house. I could see dim light of his kitchen from the curtained window. Inhaling sharply, I wiped away a stray tear as I banged on his door. Through the curtains, I could see his figure shift. The position felt strangely familiar, and my thoughts briefly strayed to the amount of times I had been on his porch in some kind of distress. Connell wasn't in a hurry to get to the door, taking his time to walk over. I shifted from foot to foot as I waited for him to open the door, periodically glancing over at my own house. When he did open the door, he was taken aback by the sight. I let out an upset cry, wrapping my arms around his torso. He stood there, shocked. "Ruby, darling, what's wrong?" he questioned, closing the door behind us as he led me to his couch. I tried to speak, but another cry left my lips as I thought about everything that had happened. Connell sat me down, wiping the tears from my cheeks with his thumbs as he shushed me. When I had finally stopped weeping, he held my hand, waiting for me to speak. "I just got so mad at her," I jabbered, my hand squeezing his hard. I couldn't stop myself. Connell's expression seemed to become more worried, and he glanced at the door as though the police were about to bound in. "What did you do?" Connell asked, his tone laced with stress. I inhaled sharply, coughing from the lack of air I could get in my lungs. My wolf took over. I couldn't control her, I continued. I could feel a headache start to come on, and I pressed on my temples gently, before looking at Connell again. The lines on Connell's face deepened as he seemed to drift off to his thoughts. I started, swallowing painfully. I told them all, I said, slowly, sniffing. Connell paused, confusion on his face. "You told them?" "Yes." "You told them what?" I blinked at him, tilting my head. My cheeks were still wet, but I was no longer crying. "What do you mean?" "I told my family that we're mates," I exclaimed. Connell sat still for a second, processing the information. After he had done that, he muttered a low, "Oh." "I'm sorry," I said in a shaky voice, my tears ducts kicking in once again. 𝐶𝐿 had a frown on his face, but he didn't look angry. Worried maybe, but not angry. I climbed forward, my arms going around 𝐶𝐿's neck as I exhaled. He wrapped his arms around my waist, sighing. "It's going to be okay," he soothed, his hand touching my face gently. I leaned into it like a cat, exhaling slowly. "I thought you had killed someone," 𝐶𝐿 confessed slowly, his warm breath tickling the side of my face. I lifted my eyebrow, looking at him. "Almost," I responded, snuggling into his grip. Before he could respond, I let out a yawn. Sinking down into his embrace, I put my head to his chest. 𝐶𝐿 said something, but I wasn't listening as I was lulled to sleep by the rhythmic beating of his heart. Mika's journal. I shut my eyes tightly as a stream of light escaped the gray curtains that covered 𝐶𝐿's bedroom windows. The night had been rough, with my dreams constantly muddled with my parents' rage. I wasn't entirely sure how angry they would be, but I didn't really want to know. 𝐶𝐿 let me sleep in his bed, and to my request, he slept with me. It was a surprisingly bland PG-13 experience. At the shift of the bed, I peeked open my eye to look at 𝐶𝐿. He was shirtless, which was a nice sight, with low-hanging sweatpants. In an attempt to save some small section of my damaged moral compass, I just focused on his eyes. "You took the covers halfway through the night," 𝐶𝐿 said gruffly. I pulled the covers, that were all on my side, up to my cheeks. "Sorry," I mumbled into the cover, blinking a few times. 𝐶𝐿 lifted an eyebrow. "You were awake during that," 𝐶𝐿 reminded, reaffirming his disposition. I didn't answer him, but a smile came to my face. Turning away from him, I covered my head with the blanket, wrapping my arms around my legs. 𝐶𝐿 said nothing more as he went into the bathroom. I lifted my head when I heard the lock of the door, and shortly after, the crank of the shower. Kicking the blankets off of me, I sat up, rubbing my eyes. I could only imagine it was mid-morning, considering the bright sunlight streaming through the window. My parents hadn't come after me, probably brooding in their room as they mulled over the fact that their daughter was mates to their much older neighbor. Add substitute teacher to that, and wrap it in a pretty bow, and you have pretty much the worst gift ever. I had unfortunately left my phone in my room, so there was no way for me to contact them. Unless, of course, I was to walk across the street and into my house. That wasn't going to happen anytime soon. Climbing out of 𝐶𝐿's bed, I stretched. 𝐶𝐿's room was simple, with gray walls and light gray accents. I didn't dwell on looking around, knowing most of what there was to be seen. Curiosity still flowed through my veins, though, so I left the room, looking for something else to get into. I looked into the first room I could find, which I realized was just a small library. The books captured my attention, but I only looked at them briefly before I turned to something else. As I shut that door, a familiar door caught my eye. For some reason, Mika's room had never caught my attention before. Perhaps it's just the thoughts I shoved deep into my memories, the things I wanted to forget. The things that made me sad. I opened her door slowly, my stomach turning at the familiar creak as it slid open. For the most part, the room was empty. There was an empty bed frame which Mika's parents had left. A small desk that Mika used to use was still in the corner. The pastel pink walls I was accustomed to were now a muted gray. I took a few steps forward, doing a turn so I could look at everything. The horrible attempt we had made when we were kids for height markings were still etched into the door frame. My hand lingered on the carved markings, remembering how much trouble we got in when her parents found them. They weren't even accurate, since I couldn't reach Mika at that age, and so I just estimated to make the marking. Pulling my hand back as though I had been burned, I looked around the room once more. There was a window next to the bed, which caught my attention. Walking forward a few steps, I looked out the window. It was facing the neighbor's house, but nothing more. When we were kids, Mika had sheer white curtains to cover the window. They did little in the form of privacy, but they were very pretty. Sudden memories of Mika and I playing around in the room flooded back to me. I remembered with a wince the time when I tripped and hit my head on her bedpost. Luckily, I was basically unharmed, but it freaked us out. Sadness pitted itself in my stomach as I looked around the room once more, various memories coming back. I hadn't been in the room in so long I had forgotten most of the past. Turning slowly, I started to walk towards the door, figuring that 𝐀𝐿 would be getting done with his shower soon. Somehow he took 10 minutes in the shower, whilst I took 45 on a good day. I was nearly at the door when I was tripped suddenly. Rebalancing myself before I fell, I sighed, turning to look at what I tripped over. The floor was nearly all even, but one floorboard near the middle of the room was lifted slightly. I squinted my eyes, taking a few steps forward. Squatting, I looked at the raised board, leaning forward to touch it. There was a gap between the boards, which I could only assume I had caused when I tripped over it. Underneath the board, I could see something. It looked like a bunch of paper, bound together. Furrowing my eyebrows, I pulled on the board to see if it would budge. Unfortunately, it stayed put, the nails on the other side of the board still deep in the wood. Sighing, I tried to think of what to do. I could just pull it up using my wolf strength and face the wrath of 𝐀𝐿 for tearing up his floor. Or I could just ask 𝐀𝐿 to do it for me, using my convincing nature. I decided against the latter, instead positioning myself behind the board. I curled my fingers around the wood and held on tightly before pulling up. The wood barely budged, all of the nails keeping it in place. I let out a sigh, slacking before trying to pull it up once more. I could feel my face get hot as I struggled to pull the board up. Once again, it didn't move, leaving me panting at the side. I really shouldn't have skipped Jim, I panted, scooting away from the board. Dottie seemed to be completely uninterested in the whole ordeal, lending me no help. Biting my lip, I stood, thinking of what to do. It seemed like 𝐀𝐿 would be my best bet for getting whatever was under that board. Standing, I brushed the dust from my shorts, turning on my heel. I found 𝐀𝐿 looking through his closet for a shirt. Of course, his closet was meticulously organized, unlike mine. When I stumbled in, he glanced over at me, starting to button his shirt up. "Good morning," he said slowly, walking over to me. I sat on his bed, crossing my legs. I gave him a sweet smile, batting my eyes gently. 𝐀𝐿 finished buttoning his shirt and watched me, pausing for a moment. "You want something, don't you?" 𝐀𝐿 said knowingly, crossing his arms. My smile dropped and I took a deep breath. "I kind of found something, but I need your help to get it," I said simply. 𝐀𝐿 blinked a few times. "Why do you need my help?" I just smiled gently, flipping my hair over my shoulder. I then proceeded to drag him into 𝐀𝐥𝐸's room, which he had rarely come into. After I did that, I pointed to the board and told him in a sweet voice, "I want you to pull that up." 𝐀𝐿 again paused before looking at me with an incredulous look. "You want me to pull up one of my floorboards?" he asked, looking at me as though I was insane. "Well, I tried, but I wasn't strong enough," I exclaimed. 𝐀𝐿 shook his head, looking me up and down. "So you already tried to rip up my floorboard?" he asked. Hearing his tone, I slowed, tapping my leg. "There's something under there," I tried to convince him, pointing at the floorboard. "Please," I whined, seeing his unconvinced look. Thus ensued a continuous conversation about why we shouldn't his argument, and why we should my argument tear up the board. In the end, my wonderful persuasion won, though it meant I would have to make him coffee. The joke is on him, because I have absolutely no idea how to make coffee. 𝐀𝐿 kneeled on the ground, looking at the board. He wrapped his hands around the board the same way I did, yet with one pull, the board became loose, and he easily pulled it up. Though my mind was filled with the annoying voice asking why it was so easy for him, my curiosity was piqued when I saw what was buried inside the boards. A small square space was open beneath the floorboards, and in the middle was a book. Well, a notebook with a dusty brown cover and just yellowing pages. "See, I told you," I told him, getting to my knees as well. "I need to redo the floors," 𝐀𝐿 murmured to himself, completely dismissing the journal as he inspected the floorboards. They were very old, considering the house was old. Dipping my hands into the small area, I wrapped my fingers around the book and gently pulled it up. Brushing the dust off, I opened the front cover. Inscribed on the front cover in black ink was 𝐀𝐥𝐸's name. Through flipping through the pages, I quickly realized what it was: a diary. "What did you find?" 𝐀𝐿 asked, snapping out of his floor, fixing days. I blinked a few times, before lifting the journal so he could see. He took it out of my hand, examining it closely. I guess she kept a journal, and it got left behind when she ran away, I told him as he flipped through the pages. Connell inspected it for a few seconds longer, before shrugging and handing it back to me. He placed the board back in its place, standing. Shaking his head, he muttered, "The things I do for you." I smiled at him as he left the room, clutching the journal tightly in my hands. Standing, I ran to catch up with him, following him closely down the stairs. When we got to the kitchen, I sat on one of his kitchen stools, opening the journal to the first page. "Don't forget you have to make me coffee," Connell told me as he got out a carton of eggs. "I don't know how to make coffee," I informed him, scanning the first page. Connell sighed, shaking his head as he turned away from me. It was basic stuff about her, and an awkward intro to the diary. To my interest, at the very bottom of the page were the words, "If anyone shall read this, I will kill you." The strange thing was that they were crossed out, like she was taking back her words. I flipped through the first few pages, scanning the writing easily. Nothing stood out to me, nothing of very much interest. Nearing the middle of the book, there was a page marked by a dog-eared corner. At the very top was the date, which indicated it was a few months before she had run away. There was a few lines of writing, most of which seemed to be pulled straight from a book. Other paragraphs seemed to be pulled from McKay's own life. It was formal, much more formal than her other entries. "My grandmother gave me my ring when I was a baby. My mother says that she was thrilled to give it to me, but as always, I could see the disdain in my mother's face when she told me of this fact. For many years it was tucked away in my jewelry box, because my fingers were too small to wear it. When I could fit it around ring finger, I felt a surge of something. Power, I suppose it must have been. At the time I thought nothing of it, and continued with my life. On my 13th birthday I was mailed a letter. Upon opening it, I realized it had been written to me by my grandmother, whom had postponed it being sent, far past her death. The letter was ordinary at most, but nearing the end was a recommendation for a book. Well, less of a recommendation and more of a pointed order. I found the book in my father's library, tucked between two dusty books about pack politics. I flipped to the page she told me to look at read it. Everything became clear after I had read it, as though a cloud of misunderstanding had been wiped away. The first few sentences read as such little is known about the Ring of 𝐊𝐿𝐼, once in the ownership of Timothy McDowne, whom was said to rule power over a strong North America pack. After his death, the ring went missing, and has since been unfound. The things we do know about the ring are as followed. The ring is an enhancer of power. Any keeper of the ring will have power 10 times greater than the average wolf. The ring can only have one keeper, who will be the only one able to access the ring's energy. When that person dies, the ring's power will be handed down to whomever the keeper chooses. The ring is as much of a curse as it is a blessing. I put the journal down, and everything started to click together. Mika's grandmother was a very powerful wolf, but kept to a very nomadic lifestyle. She died a year after McKay was born, but left her the ring as a gift. I don't believe I will last very much longer with the ring now. Someone has found out that I have the ring, and I believe they are going to come for me. I made a careless mistake, but I'm not ready to pay for it. I stared at the page, my hand reaching for the ring that was secured on a chain around my neck. "Connell," I said slowly, processing the words I had just read. Connell had just finished pouring himself a cup of coffee, but because of the tone of my voice, came over. Connell lifted the journal from the counter, sitting on a stool next to me. I watched as he read it, taking breaks to examine the ring. When Connell finished reading, he had a confused look on his face. His eyes cast up and he grabbed for the ring, looking at it in his hand. "You said she gave you that ring?" he asked. I nodded, unclasping the necklace so that he could look at it closer. "She said it was an enhancer," I told him, reading over a few lines of the diary. "I've never heard of this ring before. It must be a lost story." A lost story in the werewolf community is a story that is lost to most people's memories. The story of the first Luna is one that is told among packs for many years. Other stories that are classified as lost stories are generally unknown to the majority of the werewolf population. Connell sighed. "I told you people were coming for that ring." He wasn't happy. The look on his face was clear. Connell put the necklace in the palm of his head, looking at it closely. There was nothing in particular that would indicate that it was anything less than normal other than the inscriptions on the inside, which we still weren't sure what meant. 𝐶𝐿 gently took my hand, letting the ring fall into it. He closed my fingers around the ring, rubbing his thumb on the top of my hand. I found a letter from 𝐊𝐿, I told 𝐶𝐿. Remembering the letter I had found hidden in my treehouse, I had forgotten about it because of the commotion of the past few weeks. What did it say? It was talking about how she had to leave because someone was chasing her. I think it said something about how she was heading towards Louisiana. 𝐶𝐿 sighed, his hand going to his forehead. She must have thought they would follow her. That's why she gave you the ring, he said slowly. Because they wouldn't come for the ring. They wouldn't know. Besides, the ring needs its keeper to work. I bit my lip, looking at the ring in my hand. The ring needed its keeper. If they're coming for the ring, they must already have the keeper, I said slowly, looking up at him. They already have 𝐊𝐿. 𝐶𝐿 thought about it for a moment, before nodding. I frowned deeply, thinking of what awful things they could be doing to 𝐊𝐿. Upon seeing my face, 𝐶𝐿 placed his hand on my leg. It's okay, he said gently. They won't hurt her. There's no need. They need her for the ring to work. I tried to take his words to heart, but my mind was clouded with too many thoughts. Closing my eyes tightly, I squeezed my hand shut, feeling the imprints of my ring. Don't worry, Ruby, we'll find her, 𝐶𝐿 said soothingly, pulling me into a hug. I wrapped my arms around his neck, exhaling slowly. Before we could pull away, 𝐶𝐿's doorbell rang. My eyes snapped open and I shoved away from him, looking towards the door. You don't get visitors often, do you? I asked. 𝐶𝐿 shook his head and we both looked at the door. The doorbell rang again, this time accompanied with some knocking. We both knew who it was. Standing, I tiptoed to the window, glancing out before nodding. Code red, I said quickly, though 𝐶𝐿 had no idea what that meant. 𝐶𝐿 had barely gotten a chance to shake his head before he pointed towards the living room. I walked out of the kitchen, ducking past the windows to get to the living room. Once I had gotten there, I sat on one of the couches, turning to look at 𝐶𝐿. Before he opened his door, he looked at me and gave me a quick wink before pulling it open. 55555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555555 The conversation. My mother is an intimidating woman when she wants to be. She met both of us with a straight face, but her eyes were slit in such a way that I knew she had to be pissed. Or in this case, beyond pissed. I wanted to sink into the couch as both my parents came into view, my father holding a near same expression as my mother. He couldn't hide his anger well, though, and his mouth was tilted in a frown. Connell looked at both of them, trying to decide on the best way to talk to them. "Good to see you," he said slowly. My mother blinked before looking at my dad. I furrowed my eyebrows but said nothing as I peeked over the couch. Connell moved to the side to let my parents in, looking at me shortly after. My parents followed his gazes, and I could see a very tiny shift in my mother's expression. She walked forward, paying no attention to anyone else as she came up to me. Before I could say anything, she wrapped her arms around me, holding me tightly to her chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered into my shoulder. I stayed quiet, inhaling the comforting smell of lavender. "I'm sorry," I said once I could, before breaking away from her. My mother's eyes were both gentle with caring and angry. Not at me, particularly. I believe she was angry at the situation. My father came up to me next, taking me into his arms. He was the more gentle of the two, but as he hugged me, he radiated anger. Still, it wasn't pointed at me, but the situation. And certainly a bit towards Connell. Speaking of, Connell came around the couch, sitting on one of his chairs on the opposite side of the coffee table. As I hugged my father, I turned to look at him. Connell seemed to have zoned out for a minute, but came to attention at my gaze. "We have to talk," my mother said sternly, crossing her arms as she looked at Connell. I fiddled with my hair, wrapping a long curly piece around my finger nervously. Connell nodded, and though he had a calm disposition, I could see the way his eyes shifted with nerves. When did you find out? My mother asked first, inhaling deeply as she looked at 𝐀𝐿. A few months ago, I answered for him. My mother's eyes shifted to me, before going back to 𝐀𝐿. You rejected her, my mother continued. 𝐀𝐿 tensed up, sitting up straighter. I had my reasons, 𝐀𝐿 answered. What reasons could dictate that? My mother hissed. Mom, stop, I interrupted, drawing her attention. My mother seemed to bite back words, leaning back into the couch with her arms crossed. I promise it was best. At the time, 𝐀𝐿 tried once again. I could see that his features were clouded with shame. My mother exhaled, her slit eyes looking back at 𝐀𝐿. Fine. Let's talk about how you're a grown man with a teenager. 𝐀𝐿 seemed taken aback, blinking a few times before looking fully at her. She's 18. Which is an adult, I interrupted him. My mother frowned, looking at me. You're a teenager, she said once more, as though it would change my perspective. We've not done anything, I defended myself. Besides, it wouldn't matter. Werewolf states that as long as both parties are adults, it is okay. Human law says that too. I could practically see my mother's blood boiling as she looked between us. She's too young, she said pointedly to 𝐀𝐿, ignoring what I said. I exhaled, looking away. I understand you're concerned, but it isn't your right, 𝐀𝐿 said. I peeked at him, surprised. It's our right as parents, my father seethed, finally speaking up. I glanced at him, shock flowing through my veins at the change in character. That's my baby, and you hurt her, he continued, and I could see him struggle to seat himself. You played with her like a toy. 𝐀𝐿 stayed silent, watching my father as he piped in fury. He had that strange, calm demeanor he always had, watching my father under his thick eyelashes. Swallowing his pride, 𝐀𝐿 sat up. I'm sorry, he said slowly, looking at my parents. I didn't want to hurt her. I never wanted that. I thought by staying away from her, I was keeping her safe. I looked back at my parents, who were starting to calm down. My mother had a frown on her face, but I could see in her eyes that she was conflicted. You're a dumbass, my mother responded. 𝐀𝐿 chuckled. Yeah, I was. 𝐀𝐿's blue eyes found mine, and he seemed to let out a gentle sigh of relief. The worst was over. Looking back at my parents, 𝐀𝐿 leaned forward. I really like your daughter, 𝐀𝐿 declared gently, looking at me out of the corner of his eye. She's my other half, my mate. You can't take her from me, 𝐀𝐿 said, a bit more sternly. My father still looked angry, but tried to keep it down. My wolf won't let you take her from me. He's far too attached, 𝐀𝐿 continued, before looking at me. His eyes twinkled as he smiled lightly. I guess I am too. I smiled, putting my hands over my pink cheeks. Looking to my mom, I grabbed her hands, keeping it to my chest. You always told me that when my mate found me, he'd take care of me, I told her. She nodded, her gentle eyes meeting mine. I promise he'll take care of me, I leaned closer to her, and if not, I'll just send you to him. My mom laughed, but I could see the tears forming in her eyes. Okay, she whispered, hugging me. Once she was done, my father gave me a quick squeeze, kissing me on the cheek. I stood from the couch, looking at both of them. They began talking to each other in quiet voices. I smiled, looking over to 𝐀𝐿, who was still in his chair. He seemed to have nodded off, looking towards the outside window. Walking over to him, I hit him on his shoulder, getting his attention. Did it go well? He whispered to me, glancing over to my parents who were talking quietly amongst themselves. As well as it could go, I guess, I answered. He grabbed my hand, sighing as he held it near his heart. I leaned down to him, my eyes still watching my parents. I kissed him on the cheek, before moving up a bit. Now we have to tell your parents, I reminded him. He sighed, nodding. I got back up right before my parents could see me. I smiled at them, putting my hand on the back of 𝐀𝐿's seat. We have a few requests, my father told us, at least until she's out of your class. Mom, I complained, crossing my arms. My mother just gave me a look, which quieted me. First, you don't get to stay over at his house, my father said. He looked at 𝐀𝐿 with a dangerous gleam in his eyes, before continuing. No sex, drugs, drinking, parties. No fun, I whispered under my breath, catching my mother's glare. That's fine, 𝐀𝐿 said in a cool voice. I gave him a glare, but he ignored it. Take care of her, my father said in a low voice. He leaned forward, and I could see his eyes flash colors. If you don't, and you hurt her, I will rip your throat out, he said in a venomous tone. I blinked a few times, my mouth falling open. 𝐀𝐿 stayed relaxed, fixing the cuff of his shirt. Feel free, he responded. I looked at him, frowning. Okay, that's enough talk about rules and killing 𝐀𝐿. Are we finished? I asked, taking a few steps towards the door. Yeah, we're done, my mother said, standing with my dad. They both walked out of the living room and to the door, me trailing behind them. 𝐀𝐿 caught up to me, his warm body following me closely as we walked to the door. I could feel his hand on my waist and silently wondered if he wanted to die. My parents didn't notice, instead opening the door, taking a few steps out. Ruby, you need to come home and say goodbye to everyone. They're leaving a bit early, my mother informed me. I frowned, wishing they were already gone. Both of my parents gave 𝐀𝐿 one last look before walking down the porch steps towards the street. Turning back to 𝐀𝐿, I let out a long sigh. That went better than it could have, 𝐀𝐿 mused, wrapping his arms around me. You're still alive, I said, smiling. Barely. 𝐀𝐿 winked. Leaning down, he kissed me, tightening his arms around me. I kissed back, wrapping my arms around his neck. When we pulled apart, I didn't let him move away from me. So about those rules, do we have to follow them all? I asked. There was a glint in his eyes, and he chuckled. Yes, Ruby, he answered, pulling my arms off of his neck. Like all of them? I asked again. 𝐀𝐿 walked back into his house, waving as he watched me. Mainly the second rule is that out of bounds? I asked. 𝐀𝐿 shut the door in my face, and I could hear him laughing. 𝐀𝐿, I yelled. At no response, I huffed and turned on my heels. Walking down his steps, I made my way back home. When I crossed the street to my house, I saw him watching me through his kitchen window. Giving him a cheeky wink, I turned away, going home. Healing. I tried to breathe deeply as I walked down the sidewalk towards my house. My parents were already there, talking with my family. A few of them noticed me coming, but in true style, pretended nothing had happened as they waved to me. I was thankful. I didn't feel like explaining myself to everyone. Aunt Jessica sat leaned against my car, watching me with dull eyes and a sad frown. I walked over, ignoring lingering stares as I went to her. When I got to her, she sighed, and got that motherly type smile on her face. Ruby, honey, I'm sorry, she said as soon as she met me. I lifted an eyebrow before standing next to her. I shouldn't have said what I said, even if I didn't know he was your mate, she continued. I shrugged, inhaling. You may want to tone it down a bit, but I know you didn't know, I told her. She had a gentle smile on her face and put her arm around me. You're lucky, Ruby, you've got a man that will always love you. I was just angry I didn't have that. The sweet smell of her perfume encased me, and as I stayed quiet, I let myself forget. She had to leave soon after, Jackson claiming that he had lost his bag. I watched as they left, exhaling shakily. Though it had felt like one weight had been lifted from my shoulders, another dark cloud still loomed over me. Looking over towards the front steps of my house, I saw Jeanette sitting isolated from everyone else. No one seemed to notice the odd change in her behavior, except for her brother, who watched her with a worried expression. Deciding to bite the bullet, I stood and walked over to where she was sitting. She didn't seem to notice me until I sat next to her. When she did notice me, her eyes got big, and she seemed to straighten up a bit, as though she had been caught with her hand in the cookie jar. She must not like being caught off guard. Still, instead of snapping at me like she normally did, she just relaxed and got a downcast look on her face. Hey, Ruby, she said quietly. I let out a huff as I sat on the step next to her, stretching my legs out once I was settled in. She looked at me from her corner, her eyes curious. You okay? I asked. She seemed a bit surprised by my question, but just smiled gently. I don't know, she said honestly, furrowing her eyebrows as she became downtrodden once again. You were right. I looked at her, lifting an eyebrow. I was trying to think back at what I was right about. My mate isn't exactly a walk in the park, she continued. I realized then what she was talking about. I shouldn't have said anything. I interrupted, feeling a pit of guilt as I thought back to what I had said before. She got a sweet, tight smile on her face, and she shrugged. I said worse, she responded. My mate is in love with someone else, Jeanette said suddenly. There was a shift of her eyes, a look of relief crossing her face, relieved that she could finally say it out loud. I should be mad. I really should, but I'm not. He loved her before he met me. He has a right, she continued. Her face was red and her eyes were clouded with running thoughts. But still her voice trailed off, and she got the same sorry look on her face as she had before. I sat there quiet, unsure what to say. I had been rejected, which is the worst thing that can happen to a wolf, but my mate hadn't been in love with someone else. In a way, I could understand how that could hurt more. Connell rejected me at first. I was so upset for so long, and I don't think I would have ever truly healed from it. Jeanette looked even core miserable, sinking down further. But I don't think the moon goddess makes mistakes. Her eyes lifted to mine, and I could see her lips twitch as she inhaled. It was something so simple, something many people would cast off as stupid. To us, though, it was all we had, and that's what we hung to. I hope you're right, Ruby, Jeanette told me. Come on, kids, time to go. We both looked up. Aunt Laura was forcing her husband into her car, ushering Jeanette to hurry up at the same time. Max looked to Jeanette, putting his hand out to her. I could see them as I saw Zach and I. Zach was undeniably protective over me, and Max seemed to be the same, though he was technically younger than Jeanette by a few minutes. He wrapped his arm around Jeanette, hugging her as they walked to their car. I watched as they left, waving once they had all gotten into the car. Jackson and Jessica were off soon after, with Alexander parked in the back with an annoyed expression. There was no doubt she would dwell on the terrible Thanksgiving experience until at least the next Thanksgiving. Still, I gave her a sweet smile and waved to them all as they pulled out of the driveway. When they were all gone, I let out a sigh of relief. I still had 2 days of Thanksgiving break, and deep down I hoped that was the end of the trauma. You okay, Ruby? Zach asked as he looked down at me. I looked up and nodded with a sweet smile. Yeah, I'm great.